This video 6 comprises two interviews with Australian biologist Jeremy Griffith. First, a 2014 interview by leading Australian broadcaster Brian Carlton, 34 minutes. Second, a 1988 interview by renowned Australian journalist Caroline Jones on her ABC Radio National program The Search for Meaning, 33 minutes. This interview received the second most enthusiastic response in the program's twice-weekly 8-year history.
My name is Brian Carlton. I'm an Australian journalist, commentator and broadcaster, and I'm here with biologist Jeremy Griffith to discuss his forthcoming book, Is It to Be Terminal Alienation or Transformation for the Human Race? Before receiving an advance copy of Is It to Be, I was already aware of Jeremy's work. In fact, I interviewed Jeremy on my radio show about one of his earlier books. I remember when I opened the interview to the listeners to call in, there was so much interest that the interview went for almost 2 hours, and I'm really not exaggerating. I know that Jeremy caused a similar response when he spoke on Caroline Jones' famous radio show, The Search for Meaning. In that case, the interview gained one of the biggest responses Caroline had ever received in the many, many hundreds of programs she made over the years. I think the response was second only to an interview she did with a nun in South America. I also know Jeremy's 2003 book, A Species in Denial, was a bestseller in Australia, I know, because I bought one and read it several times. So I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. Jeremy, tell me about this new book you've written.
Firstly, this is the Spoon Man. For many years, for many years, Brian was the compere of a popular radio program on Triple M in Sydney, where he was affectionately known as the Spoon Man, the professional stirrer. He was the Wolfman Jack of the airwaves in Australia. So that's a bit of background on who Brian really is. When we're about 12 years old, because the adults sort of living in denial of the human condition and learnt to do that, adolescents start seeing the imperfection of life around them and start wrestling with that and thinking deeply about it. And they soon realise that for some reason adults don't want to talk about it, so they're left on their own. So at about 12, they actually start trying to sort of understand. At 9, kids are sort of flailing out at the imperfections of the world and frustrated. But we actually changed from going from primary school to senior school is around 12, and that's actually in recognition that there's some real psychological change from flailing out at the world in our late childhood when you get bullying and so forth, the so-called noisy nines. They suddenly become sober, deeply thoughtful adolescents, and that's when they go to senior school. Because there is this big shift. The brain of children shifts from, flailing out in frustration at the imperfection of life gets you nowhere. Ultimately, you're going to have to stop and try to understand why the world's imperfect. So they actually start thinking deeply. They change from being an extrovert to a sobered introvert. And so around 12, when they go to senior school, they start this search for trying to understand the human condition, the imperfection of human life begins and it deepens. So they keep thinking about it. They've learnt that the adult world doesn't want to talk about it, and everyone's sort of pretending everything's fine, and they can see quite clearly it isn't. So by the time they get about 14 or 15, something serious starts to happen. They start to discover the human condition within themselves, the imperfections within themselves, that there's sort of angers and meanness and selfishness and indifference to others. And they're still thinking completely honestly. They're still facing the issue of the human condition. So when it actually deepens, they hit this crisis point in there, normally around 15 or so, when they finally discover the human condition within. They're trying to face that down, and it's suicidally depressing trying to try to confront it without an understanding of it. And so they go into this crisis that I've called resignation, when they resign to thereafter living in denial of the human condition. They go on become an escapist, a superficial life. They never want to go near that dark corner again. So it's very rare to find any description of a kid going through this, because the adult world, as I said, have already resigned, so they don't want to listen. But there are some marvellous descriptions of children going through resignation. This is probably one of the best. It's from American Pulitzer Prize-winning child psychologist Robert Coles, and he describes this encounter he had with a child going through this crisis point in resignation, and I think everyone will be able to relate to this. I tell of the loneliness many young people feel. It's a loneliness that has to do with self-imposed judgment of sorts. I remember a young man of 15 who engaged in light banter, only to shut down, shake his head, refuse to talk at all when his own life and troubles became the subject at hand. He had stopped going to school. He sat in his room for hours listening to rock music. The doors closed. I asked him about his head-shaking behaviour. I wondered whom he was thereby addressing. He replied, no one. I hesitated, gulped a bit, and took a chance. Not yourself. He looked right at me now in a sustained stare for the first time. Why do you say that? He asked. I decided not to answer the question in the manner in which I was trained, basically as an adult, to deny the issue of the human condition. Instead, with some unease, I heard myself saying, I've been there. I remember being there. Remember when I felt I couldn't say a word to anybody. The young man kept staring at me, didn't speak. When he took out his handkerchief and wiped his eyes, I realised they had begun to fill. Now, obviously, what had happened is the boy was in tears because Coles had reached him with some recognition and appreciation of what he was wrestling with. I mean, Coles had shown some honesty about what the boy could see and was struggling with, namely the horror of the hypocrisy of human behaviour, including his own behaviour. So that's a marvellous little capturing of this moment. And the child is in his own room, he's immersed, lost in himself, he can't relate to the world world's not acknowledging what he's wrestling with. He's dying a million deaths inside himself, and there's lots of other descriptions of going through this tight corner. So that's there's a lot more about the process of resignation that children go through, but what the essence of it is that it reveals just how terrifying the issue of the human condition really is, because these children are actually trying to face it down and can't. It's just leading to suicidal depression, and they have to jump off this cliff, catcher in the rye, catch them before they're jumping off the cliff, resign themselves to living in denial of the human condition and never go near it again. So the problem my book's got is when it brings that brings them back into contact with that, they tend to be psychologically don't want to go near it.
That resonates with me. I was that young man. I locked myself in my room listening to music of alienation, and at the same time reading everything I could get my hands on, in the belief that if I just found out why nobody's talking about this, then I will be able to understand it. So yeah, that absolutely resonates with me. Listening to music and reading, locked in my room for a couple of years as an early teenager, it was a very real thing.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people can remember that, and that's so precious to, that's the benefit of using the resignation explanation, because people can actually remember going through it, and once they know that they've been through it, then they've got that anchor to know, it was a terrifying subject.
It's a life-changing experience. It really is. It certainly was for me. Yeah.
That's what happens when you tell them about resignation. It helps because then people are connected then for the first time for a long time in their life to that experience.
Well, I wished I'd known then what I know now.
Yeah.
And what you've said is pretty terrifying, but I remember as a kid listening to rock music. There's one particular song that got me, Midnight Oil. I think it's called Only the Strong. And the opening lines in the song are, when I'm locked in my room, I just want to scream. And as a young kid going through this process, it talked to me, it said to me, there is at least one other human on earth who's been through what I'm going through now. And that spoke volumes to me. Just a couple of lines of music was all it took to make me go, I feel a little bit better about this than I did.
Yeah, someone would reach you with some honesty.
Absolutely.
Exactly like Cole's situation and Catcher in the Rye. Finally, yeah, that's how precious, that's how lonely it is going through this, and how, by inference, how dishonest the adult world is. It's all resigned, no one's talking any truth. You find one little bit of truth, and you just lock on, it saves your life.
And indeed, that's exactly what happened. Yeah. I went from being terribly alienated to just a little less alienated, which helped a lot. Yeah, helped a lot.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, yeah, I mean,
Just the number of times I reflect, that chat we had in the book is stuck in my mind for a long time, and I see things all the time, and I go, Jeremy, no, that's that.
It's what he's dealing
That's
with.
this, and I can see the denial, and I have conversations with people about this massive amount of denial going on here, and they sort of look at you like eyes glaze over, and what are you talking about? Like, oh, forget it. So yeah, don't underestimate the extent to which your earlier works had an impact on me in terms of how I think about what I'm seeing, how I interpret behaviour, and I worked up this ability to be able to work out what a person was like in the first 5 or 6 seconds of a conversation with them on the telephone, and I could second guess why they're saying what they're saying, and hear the subtext in their words, and it was hugely valuable as a broadcaster when you're taking lots and lots of calls from people who are fundamentally strangers to you, and they start telling you about their life story and things like that, and you can plug into what they're talking about and how they're talking about it, and a lot of that came from your books, because you would be able to, you do this, you can observe the denial in people. You can observe the souls who are not real happy with themselves.
You finally got insight into what's happening.
You've
got the riddle, the tool to make sense of it at last.
But it works.
Yeah.
That's the other thing. It's not when you just read the book, it sort of sounds esoteric and kind of out there, but the trickle-down transfer to everyday life and everyday human relationships and experiences has been hugely valuable. And I don't say that pissing in your pocket. I'm really not. It did make a huge difference. Huge.
Anyway, well, that's the benefit of hanging in there. But yeah, those poems and things, they do capture the truth about the state of the world and what the unresigned mind, the adolescents can see.
I wished I had the thing as a 15-year-old. I mean, I really do. I was reading quite, fairly thick, dense books at 14, 15, but I wish I had this one. Would have saved me 2 or 3 years of angst.
Yeah.
Easily. And probably another, 6 or 7 years of trying to work out what I wanted to do with my life and how hard I did actually want to change everything. And I'm not a sort of issues-based crusader as such, but there's just so much around that needs work, needs fixing, and I had this ability, or not, I'm not sure, but a capacity to work out a way where we could do this better, how we could do it better, it's my fight, it's my personal fight. I was not going to let it beat me, and if I can't quite accept the way the world is, then I'm not going to sit down and do nothing. I will use whatever I have at my disposal, which in my case was a microphone and a transmitter, to try and at least make people think about the process of change. Giving up was never an option. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've always thought, Brian, that we call you people like you ships at sea, people who didn't properly resign. They didn't pull into a port when the storms came. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's a torturous choice to make, because then you're forever tumbled around by the imperfection of life.
But it's honest, Jeremy.
Yeah.
It's honest.
Yeah.
I live my life honest with myself,
yeah.
and I sleep soundly at night. Yeah. I'm happy with my choices, as difficult as they were, and are. I'm happy, personally happy with the choices I made back then. Not easy choices, very difficult, but.
Yeah, but it does make you a heretic, and all the pain that goes with that. And like you told me earlier, you try to play it in the corporate world, and you're back there out there in the front lines of trying to shake up the box.
I've always had issues with people telling me how I should think, and what I should say, and what opinions I should have. They're very precious things to me, and I want to own mine, and I've tried as best I could to do that. So I really resent being told to toe any particular line by anybody, and I have since I was a child. Ask my mum, she'll tell you. From about the age of 8, it was, no, I'm going to do it my way because I think my way is better.
Yeah.
And if you wanted an explanation as to why my way is better, I'm happy to give that to you. Not a problem. But I just had to be. It seemed to me the only way out of this was to be as honest with myself as I could be.
Yeah, well, that's the strange paradox of the human condition, because we do resign, but then we pay such a price, becoming such a fraud and so dishonest, because we're not looking at things truthfully ever again.
Yeah.
We just lost in a sea of bullshit, really, from there on. And yeah, we get to a point not too long after that where we're wishing we could get back to some honesty. So when you don't fully let go and you keep the windows open a little ajar, talking to Harry Prosen, he's like that too. He didn't quite shut the windows properly and left them ajar and kept searching all his life for some truth. And when it came along, and in the form of the documentary proposal, when he read that, he just loved it, because he was reading some stuff that spoke to him, that part of himself that was unresigned.
Yeah.
And brought it back to life, and it was just so reinforcing. It's like what happened to Coles and
yeah, it's absolutely. And I relate to that story so vigorously. That was he might as well have been talking about me. I was that kid, and I did a lot of reading of a lot of disciplines, the various faiths. You have a crack at that first and see whether there's any answers there. For me, there wasn't. Then science had some answers, but was ultimately reductionist. And I was getting into philosophers and some pretty strange stuff, just to try and work out whether anybody did have an answer to this, whether there was any kind of coherent description of why I was feeling the way I was feeling. And the only thing that even came vaguely close to that was your books.
Yeah. Well, the trouble I've got, I mean, if everyone was unresigned, like you before this, we were talking together and you were saying, Jeremy, if you had a book for children when they're going through resignation, save their life, and they're your natural audience, because once you get talking to adults who are resigned, they're deaf to this.
Yeah, and I've been doing that my whole life as a professional communicator and broadcaster. You can see the veil of denial go up over their eyes when you raise the truth with them about something, and they honestly don't want to know. I thought early teens, sort of 13, 14, 15, is about the right age to be able to crack through some of that early denial and get to them before they
jump off the cliff,
or indeed build such a vigorous wall where they're locked behind and they don't want to open up and it's easier just to hide there behind the wall. If you can get to them before they start cementing those bricks in. That'll be your generational change, I think, but it'll be kids that age that will most get what you're talking about, because they're going through it.
Yeah, well, it'll be great when we can actually take a presentation of this, especially for resigning kids before they jump off the cliff and before they cement those bricks in, as you so accurately said. It'll be very, very precious, and as Catcher in the Rye, catching before they're jumping off the cliff. So, but we have to get a foothold in the real world and in the adult world before we can, get some sort of real support for this. So that's the conundrum that this book faces. So you've articulated the whole dilemma and what we're up against, and the beauty of finally somewhere there's some truth on this world that speaks to that part of ourselves that everyone's blocked off. So yeah, that's the whole riddle. How do you get through those cemented in bricks? And start the world in the other direction. But anyway, but yeah, the point about that song, "Life in Mind," like Midnight Oil, is it speaks to some truth about the state of the world.
There's a lot of descriptions of alienation in art, in music, in poetry. I often wonder whether those people who are exploring those areas will get what you're talking about more so than perhaps a rigid, scientifically trained mind. Just wonder sometimes.
Yeah, no. Well, I mean, artists. That's the trick with really good poetry or music or literature. The trick is to allude to the human condition, sort of take people as close as they can go without sort of actually confronting it. Because without the explanation of the human, the defence for it, it's just too...
It's almost a reflection of it, isn't it? Yeah. You're reflecting the human condition, but not doing anything to explain it, why it is.
Yes, that's right. Because until you can explain it, you really can't take them in too close to the fire. Yeah. but you can dance in close to it. And any good literature, like I wouldn't be surprised that Robert Coles didn't get the Pulitzer Prize for that actual one paragraph. Mm-hmm. It's that honest and it's that precious. In you know, I mean, he's a child psychologist. He's written this book and he talks about that and lets that truth out. And that's just so precious. So, I mean, that's it. Great art, great literature. I mean, why did Bacon's painting, you know, get the highest price ever, or next only to Munch? Because they're speaking to the truth. This is us. This is how alienated and dead we really are. And yeah, so great art, great literature, poetry, music is really the stuff that gets close to the truth. But yeah, again, you can't go right there because we haven't found the defence for ourselves.
It's scary, isn't it? When that little inside voice comes up and says, I remember this. I remember what it was like. And you go, go away.
That's
go
right.
away again. Just please be quiet.
Yeah. That's what. Yeah. So I've got to dig it up. I'm using resignation because everyone like you can remember doing it. Oh, yeah. So that reconnects them to it. And then I've got a foothold to then explain, unpack the whole riddle of... Anyway, but those poems, those songs, Life in Mind, is the very, there's incredible honesty there about the state of the world.
You can see why the radio interview went 2 hours, can't you?
You keep going, we keep cutting. We'll be cutting these on the...
We're just wrapping.
And I keep coming back trying to make it link up to where we were. And I'm thinking, shit, this is so good. Oh, let's throw this out the back window. But he's a legend, this boy. He's out there. He's someone really precious to me because it's been pretty lonely doing this job. But he's always...
Yeah, I often think about you like that. I say, how do you keep doing this? You just keep pushing on and pushing on and pushing on and gathering around clearly some like-minded individuals who get it, and trying to grow the thing. It must be a lonely place to be a lot of the time.
Yeah, well, we've got some wonderful group because people can get through this. With this explanation, once you know it, you defend it. So then you're safe. You can run around in the realm of the human condition with safety, right? So the problem is to get them through the deaf effect stage and they can start hear it. And the people have got really interested and, created this studio and everything like that. They're people who got through the deaf effect, heard this, and it just grew and grew on them. Like you said, it just becomes more addictive because it keeps you've got the tools to unravel everything. You're seeing through the human condition. And that's really exciting. And so that's just only going to grow. So it's a slow beginning, this, because very few people, they've got so many bricks in the wall they can't even hear it. Yeah. But you've got to get a few. You've got to be very, very stubborn and determined and patient, really, patient. And then it'll start to... So it's a slow beginning with a fast finish, because once everyone gets, they won't want to retreat. You can't throw away this... When you know that you've got the keys to unlock the whole mystery of what it is to be human, it just grows and grows.
You will inevitably run up against vested interest, people who like the idea that the planet is the way it is because they profit from it in whatever way, be it financially or some other way, who'll like to maintain the status quo, who'll like to keep things just the way they are because it works for them. You'll be a threat to established religions, you'll be a threat to conventional thinking on pretty much everything, all the scientific disciplines, psychology, for example, psychiatry. You're not going to need anywhere near as many of those if people had this info. You're just not going to need that paradigm shift in how humans do their thing will be actively resisted. And I'm pretty sure you felt that over the past couple of decades.
Well, we had a big court case, the biggest in Australia's history, and all that's invested interest in living in Plato's cave of denial, because they don't want the truth to come out. In fact, the persecutors actually said, you're shaking the black box inside of people and you can't succeed.
It was curious that the ABC decided to put up a man of the cloth to analyse your work, which I thought was...
Same happened with Darwin, because old Bishop Wilberforce, he stood up at that great debate at Oxford and he said, was it your grandfather or your grandmother that was related to an ape, And that's when old Huxley stood up and he said, I'd rather be related to an ape than a great man who misused his intellect to deny truth, and won the debate. Yeah. But traditionally it's always the people of the church that, fundamentalist in their thinking and don't want to open up and try to make understanding of things. So, invested interest. Yeah, but the biggest vested interest of all is in denial, is in the resigned state. Wanting to, once you've built those walls in, you don't want it to be broken down. So
they'll try and shut you up.
Yeah, they do. They've tried all those sort of things. So we have to be self-sufficient in everything we do because of that. It's the only way we can have a chance of getting these ideas out there.
An uphill battle, but a thoroughly worthy one.
Yeah, well, that's right. But psychologically, I know what we're trying to do. We're trying to turn this corner. It's the biggest paradigm shift of all, from living in denial to not. And that's why Plato's, what he described will happen when you take them out of the cave. Mm-hmm. They won't hear a single word you said. Not initially, he said. And so, it's fair warning. You try to drag them out of the cave and you're going to get a flogging. And so it's just part of the journey. But what drives me is just my love of this other world that's so much better and so much truer, this honest world. So it's like you see, you're holding on to what you knew to be true against a tidal wave of a tsunami of bullshit, right? But you said it early. You said, yeah, but what I love is that I'm being honest, and I treasure that above all that other.
Absolutely.
So that's what drives me too. I just live for this other world where we don't have to be dishonest anymore. That's what got me to these understandings. And
as a commentator on all things, I have to have a clarity of comprehension, a clarity of analysis. And the only way I can achieve that clarity is to be ruthlessly honest, even if the conclusion I'm reaching I find personally disturbing or scary, horrifying. The honesty, the self-honesty is the important thing. I can't do my job unless I'm honest.
Yeah, well, the whole of this book is based on that premise that once you're living in denial, you can't find the truth. You can't find the truth with lies. It's just fundamentally impossible. So, for example, the whole of chapter 1, and I talk about it in a moment, but I go through all the chapters in my book and how each one is access truth, and that was doing it. And the only way I've done it is by being honest and not being in denial. And when you're not living in denial of the human condition, you can actually all these truths that we've been looking for are so obvious.
Yes, they are. That's exactly right. It's very simple. It's not hard. Yeah. The end process, the revelation, if you like, is easy and reassuring and calming and self-accepting. Yeah. Getting there is the difficult bit. Yeah. Once you have the revelation, it's the clarity of it is euphoric.
Yeah, well,
almost.
All these answers that I've found, I didn't require a smart brain. It's just not living in denial. Just thinking simply and truthfully is how I found these answers. And they're sitting there for anybody and everybody. Yeah. They're self-evident if you're not wanting to avoid them. So, that's the thing. This synthesis is produced from exactly what you just said. Just, they're not actually... They are revelations in the sense that they're revealed. They're there waiting to be revealed. All you got to do is strip off the denial and they flop out. And that's all I've ever done.
But that process, the process of stripping off the denial, that's the difficult part. Yeah. Once you've done that, it's relatively simple from there on in. I found it's the answers become glaringly obvious to the next thing you have a look at, and I hate to use the word epiphany because it has a religious connotation that I really don't want to give it. It's not an emotional. Well, it isn't emotional, but it's an intellectual epiphany. It's an epiphany of mind. My understanding of this is now better than it was. I'm now more complete. Yeah. I have a more complete understanding of myself, everybody around me, the society at large, the way the planet works. It's a revelation. But again, I hesitate to use that in a religious sense because it's a different, it's a quantifiably different thing. Yeah. But it has a similar sort of impact on you as you wake up the next morning feeling more invigorated, more able to deal with the world because your level of understanding of it is so much higher.
That's what all I've ever done is taught myself to hang on to what I call it like think like a child or think like a stone. If I'm not getting there, I'm just not thinking simply enough, and letting the child and the simple obvious thing to come out, and I just got better and better at it. And And exactly that, when you do get to that clean state and just let it come out, it's so obvious. It's just it's just stunning. You know, you just think, well, you know, that's amazing, and it's like an epiphany. It's very exciting, and that's all I've ever done. I just keep taking one step, and I just keep learning. That's how I got to all these insights. Yeah. But when you put the full synthesis together using that device of just thinking truthfully, then you take it back. You know, as Plato said, you know, when someone gets outside the cave and starts not living inside it, they're facing the sun, the truth, they're thinking truthfully, and then they go back in the cave and try to release them all. The cave prisoners, you know, rebel, and they said, he actually said that they'll try and kill him, you know. Yeah. I mean, in my case, they didn't actually try and kill me. We live in more civilized times than that, but in effect they did. They did everything they could to smash me off the face of the earth. Yeah. So everything you're saying is completely, you know, making sense of everything that I've been through, and well, your own life has been through.
But you have your truth, and you've stuck to your truth, and you've fought for your truth. And they're all admirable qualities in a person. You can't criticize somebody for arguing their case, especially when the kind of work you're doing is so new to people, conceptually new to people. It's always going to be, if I can use the vernacular, pushing it uphill. Yeah. But good on you for keeping at it, because
you're right. They're actually totally sincere in what they're saying, and they're denying. They don't know that they're in denial.
No, that's right.
So you know, you can't. I'm compassionate. I'm not. I know why they're doing what they're doing. But I've got to somehow find a way through that wall of denial to get them to re-access the truth. So it is a hard, slow process, but I'm no longer criticising them. I'm actually bringing them the understanding. Yeah. So they actually want the reconciling understanding of the human condition, but they're never going to find it from their failure trap, because they're living in denial. You can't find it inside the cave. So I'm saying, look, I was out here, I found this truth. Here it is. You know, liberates you all the thing you want. You know, but they're so committed to denial, they're not receptive to it. So you know, you can knock on a deaf man's door forever. You know, it's a slow process, and we've just got to be patient.
One of my favourite expressions for lots of things is it's a process, not an event. I can't think of anything that more applies that saying might apply to as your work. I mean, it isn't a process, a long way from being any kind of event. But when you get it, for the individual, when you get it, it is an event.
Yes.
You remember the day.
Yep.
You remember the section of the book. You remember when it happened. It stays with you. It's fresh.
Yeah. You know, as to how long it'll take, you know, Desjardins once said, you know, the truth only appeared once to set the world ablaze. And it's true. It just needs a critical mass of influential people to come together and say, no, this book is really seriously important. It really has got through to the other side. And then all those that are living in denial and just treating it dismissively, they're forced to think again. And that's where you get this change of momentum. So that's why we're making such a huge effort with this book, to get that change of momentum, to get that base group of people who have managed to get through that wall of denial and discover just how honest this book is. And Harry's the first. I mean, he's amazingly just standing on his front foot and just saying it like it is. So, you know, and then we need a few more dominoes to fall like that, and then suddenly the tide's turning. There is a base of support, and it'll flow, because the world is so hungry for some truth, some answers. So once there's enough base of support, then the tide changes rapidly, because it is like a sea of dishonesty out there, and this book is an island of sanity. And everyone's looking for just that, like you were when you were 15. You're reading, you were scrounging all the library, all the great tombs, of looking for some answers.
I got to the point where I started reading Encyclopedia Britannica, reading it as a book from the beginning, thinking the answers might be there.
Right.
That's not a joke, by the way. They're quite literal.
Yeah, no.
What follows is an astonishing interview of Jeremy by renowned Australian journalist Caroline Jones on her flagship Australian Broadcasting Corporation Radio National program, The Search for Meaning, aired on the 31st of May 1988. The interview attracted, according to Jones, the second most enthusiastic public response in the programme's twice-weekly 8-year history, and, as a result, was rebroadcast twice later that year.
This is Caroline Jones. My guest this morning is Jeremy Griffith, a scientist whose search for meaning has produced a book called Free, The End of the Human Condition. The book examines the conflict between conscience and intellect, the guilt this conflict has brought to mankind, how an understanding of humanity's necessary growing up period frees us from guilt, and how humans can now look forward to peace on Earth. Jeremy was raised in the country. As a young scientist, he did a great deal of work in the wilds of Tasmania on the plight of the Tasmanian tiger. With his brother, he makes beautiful furniture, which you may have seen featured on A Big Country. But his major life work to date he considers to be his new book and its passionately held ideas. At the end of our conversation, I'll give you details about the book, but let's meet Jeremy Griffith.
Shall we start talking about childhood? And maybe you'd say something about your childhood and what that was like.
Well, I grew up in the country on a sheep property, and spent all my time playing with nature, I guess, in the bush. I was very fond of animals and birds, and that I guess I was fairly idealistic as a young man, and I guess all that isolation and the reinforcement I got from nature is the reason for that idealism. And the protection, my parents, whole background, I guess the isolation made me an idealist.
What do you remember especially about teenage and the sort of feelings you were having then? Because it always often seems to be a difficult time for us, those adolescent years.
Yeah, I guess that's when we're orientated to life's problems. And in my case, I was extremely idealistic. I had little awareness of reality, and I guess it's through our parents that we're orientated to life. We encounter the battles on Earth through discovering the battle that our parents are waging. And in my case, I saw my father as what I thought was a very good man. He almost sort of saintly, if you like, and yet the world didn't seem to recognise those qualities that I saw as so worthwhile and ideal. And so I guess my orientation as a young man was to try to champion his goodness in the world. And the journey went on, and eventually gained an understanding of why we, as humanity as a whole, when I say we, I mean we humanity, aren't able to acknowledge the ideals that I held in such high esteem.
Yes, and I know that has become something of a life work. I wondered, before we go into that, if you had, from an early age even, the idea of the existence of another world beyond this one which we live in.
Not really. The world I was living in, I was very euphoric, very happy. All my report cards at school said I had a zest for living. It was only much later on that I discovered the oppressed world, if you like. I remember someone saying to me, "Oh, you should go and listen to this person who's giving a talk, come out from America," and I went to that. And he started off by saying, "Oh, all those who've had some experience of another fabulous world at some time in their life, put their hands up." And then he counted the hands and he said, "Oh, that's usual, 70%. I usually have at some time in their life experienced an awareness of another world." But for me, I was living all the time in that other world, and I was extremely idealistic. When I went to Tasmania, I went to Tasmania to look for a rare animal. I loved animals, and I heard about this extraordinary animal in my backyard almost.
The rare animal.
The rare animal,
yes.
Yeah. Well, and this Tasmanian tiger, and I was fascinated, and I thought, well, no one seems to be doing anything about it. I mean, I wasn't aware of the human condition, the real problems on Earth. I thought this seemed to be the priority as I understood it. So I determined to go and try and save the animal, and I hitchhiked to Tasmania and started there, and went on for a period of 6 years, and that after I'd finished my university degree in science. And I discovered then that the real problem was within ourselves. But when I came out of Tasmania, something like 28 years old, I was still incredibly out of touch with reality. It was a great mystery to me. Why the devastation of our planet? Why the upset in people, the anger and aggression on Earth? It was a complete mystery. I mean, realists take the world of reality for granted. It's sort of self-evident, but to an innocent, to an idealist, it's an extraordinary mystery that no one's able to explain to them. And I remember, for instance, I could never go to a movie and sit through a movie. The only movie as a young man I sat through was a thing about Africa called Where No Vultures Fly. And I remember when I watched Gone with the Wind, for instance, and I saw that Scarlett O'Hara used other people, I just got up and walked out because I said people just shouldn't do that to each other. I can remember going to a very, coming out of Tasmania, being invited to this dinner party with all these important people, like John Walton, all these at that time, and I just couldn't cope. And eventually I stood on my chair and I accused everybody of being false and fake and laughing, and I was furious. I was black with fury because I thought that there was a real problem. It's like living in a house that's burning down and everyone's joking and pretending there's nothing wrong. So the world of reality was an extraordinary mystery to me. I was extremely idealistic.
Was it very painful feeling separate, I suppose, feeling that you had almost a separate set of values from most others?
The pain, I mean, I was living in a state of real happiness in myself. The pain was my inconsistency with the real world and the real world's inability to acknowledge the difference, that there was something, they were silent. There was this problem on Earth that no one was addressing, the suffering of others, the unhappiness of people, and no one was looking at it. And you go to university, you go to school, and they teach you mathematics. I remember asking the mathematics teacher, why are we teaching mathematics? I mean, I couldn't adopt mechanism. I couldn't evade the whole truth of the ideals of that we should be all integrative and selfless and loving and helpful and kind. Why are we so competitive and aggressive and angry? And everyone was making jokes and laughing and keeping a brave front that I didn't know. To me, it was just blatant lies and denial of the real problems on Earth. And I was furious and determined to champion, as I said, my idealism and never to let it go. And I remember when my father died, he was killed in a tractor accident, my resolve turned to rock. I said, I'm never, ever going to abandon my ideals. And but the incredible journey was, starting out so idealistic, was to finally one day discover there was a really good reason for our human upset and to learn incredible compassion for humanity. And I guess that's the journey, the grand journey, adventure of humanity as a whole.
And you've encapsulated these ideas, the result of many years of thinking, in a book called Free, The End of the Human Condition. I'm talking with Jeremy Griffith. Take us into the ideas, won't you, Jeremy?
Well, let me say for a start that my book is holistic in its approach, or deterministic, or teleological, the argument. In essence, it accepts integrative meaning, as I called it. Integrative meaning to explain that atoms form molecules, and molecules integrate to form single-celled organisms, and single-celled organisms come together to form multicellular organisms, and then the next layer is multicellular organisms come together to form societies of multicellular. If you like, the biblical equivalent to that would be the wolf lying down with the lamb. And at a higher order still, all things will finally come together to form the larger whole. I guess the religious equivalent for that would be peace on earth and in heaven. So there's this development of larger wholes, and holism means tendency in nature. If you look up in the dictionary, tendency in nature to form wholes, and teleological or deterministic argument is one that accepts purpose. Now, that purpose is this drive towards the development of ever larger and more stable wholes. Now, the essential ingredient to form a larger whole is selflessness. The parts of the whole have to consider the welfare of the whole above themselves. So unconditional selflessness is the ingredient for the development of larger wholes. Now, so selflessness is the essence of this whole process of development of order of matter, integrative commitment. But you see, the great complication that rises, or is that well humans are a competitive, aggressive, selfish species, and if we accept purpose of integrative, there's this vitalistic purpose to develop larger wholes, to be selfless, well then why are we selfish? It seems to imply that humans and humanity as a whole is a bad species. You see, it raises the question of guilt, of the origin of sin, all these questions that religions struggle with. And as the fundamental problem that humanity's agonized for ages. And so you see, humans appear to be a guilty or bad species. Now, the paradox of the human condition is that, in fact, we are not a guilty or bad species. There's a good reason for our apparent inconsistency with these ideals. And that's what my book explains. So that, as I said, I started out believing extraordinarily in these ideals of selflessness, only to find there was a reason for our selfishness, a good reason. And the thing is that science, humanity has had to evade this acceptance of integrative meaning. So it's very dangerous. The teleological or deterministic or vitalistic or holistic approach is very dangerous, since there's a great yearning on Earth at present for the new age, a great hunger that the existing world is exhausted, our planet's exhausted, we're exhausted, and the old's dying, but the new world is just not able to be born. And the holistic world, the ideal world, will not gain ascension, can never be, until we find the defense for ourselves. The reason we have to, you see, it says in the Bible, for instance, that God is love, right? Love is the theme of integrativeness, this development. So really, God is our personification of this integrative development. So God, selflessness, love, integration, all mean the same thing. But we have been an insecure species, a God-fearing species, because we haven't been able to defend ourselves in the presence of God, in the presence of integrative meaning.
So what is the defence? Take us into the defence.
Well, currently, to date, we've used what I call contrived defences for our human condition of upset, our divisive state.
For example?
There's a film out at present called The Gods Must Be Crazy, in which it contrasts the innocence of the Bushmen of the Kalahari with our mad-driven, chaotic, competitive world. But in it accounts for our competitiveness on the basis that it was due to our possessions. In the field of biology, there was Robert Ardrey's book, A Territorial Imperative, which said that our competitive nature, our selfishness, is due to our imperative to defend our territory. Currently, the prevailing scientific evasion or excuse for our divisiveness is a theory called sociobiology, which says that our selfish nature is due to our selfish genes. But as I say, these are contrived defense. They sustain us until we find the real excuse. And what I'm saying is that my book is presenting the real excuse. Just before I explain what my explanation of our upset state is, I should say that that science has had to progress mechanistically rather than holistically. As I pointed out, it had to evade acceptance of holisticness, of the development of order of matter, until such time as we could defend ourselves against it, explain ourselves. So science has very properly been mechanistic, because any acceptance of holism would only add to our sense of guilt, not alleviate it. So it's progressed by investigating reality step by proven step. But whenever it encountered a truth, a partial truth as I call it, that was dangerous, that implied that we were bad, such as integrative meaning, it evaded it. So in science, they stress entropy, which says that systems run down towards heat energy. They don't stress negentropy, which is a physical law that explains the integration of matter, that Arthur Koestler and Thierry de Chardin have accepted. They're what I call unevasive thinkers, where scientists in general are evasive thinkers. They've had to be. So science investigates the mystery, the mechanisms that might one day allow us to find an understanding. So they're evasive. Science is evasive and represses many, many partial truths that are dangerous and hides them. Now that means that when it's finding the understanding of ourselves, and it's finding all these pieces of the jigsaw of explanation, but it's unable to look at those jigsaw pieces right side up. Because they are hurtful. The picture that they're presenting is a hurtful one. It's implying that we're bad all the time. So it finds these pieces of the explanation and presents these pieces upside down. Now, in the end, it requires to synthesize the full truth that will liberate us, Someone has to go in there and look at all those pieces of the jigsaw right side up and assemble the full picture that liberates us, since the full picture doesn't criticise us, it explains us. All these partial truths tend to criticise us when the full truth won't. So it's the story of David and Goliath. In the end, the whole of humanity is arrayed at the edge of this battlefield, unable to go out into it and slay this giant Goliath. So an exceptional innocent is required at that time to go out, because these partial truths, such as integrative meaning, don't hurt someone who's not aggressive, angry, divisive, someone who is yet to become embattled. They're accepting, they're still idealistic. So my approach was a holistic approach, but I suggest that only a holistic approach in the end could unravel the jigsaw, could look at the jigsaw pieces right side up and synthesize the full picture.
I'm talking with Jeremy Griffith, who's the author of a book called Free, The End of the Human Condition, which embodies ideas which he has worked out, which have come to him over a period of many years. Before we go on, where does the religions fit into this picture?
Well, before I answer that, I really should explain the story,
Okay.
because the story involves becoming exhausted, and then when we were exhausted, we needed religion. So just to introduce my explanation for our human condition of upset, a great battle emerged. In anthropology, we know that the species Homo, which is what we are, intelligent man, emerged some 2 million years ago from the Australopithecines, who I've redescribed as child man. So during our childhood and prior to that, during our ape ancestry, we acquired what I call an instinctive orientation to integrativeness. In the equivalent in the Bible, it says in Genesis, we were once in the image of God. That is, absolutely loving, kind, selfless, generous, all these traits. And then at 2 million years, intelligent man emerged, and a great battle emerged between this intelligent self and this original instinctive self, or soul, the expression of which is our conscience. Now, we became instinctively, that is genetically, aware of what was integrative and what was divisive, what was good and what was bad. Our soul, in its conscience, is perfect in criticism but completely deficient in explanation. So the problem was the mind had to search for understanding. The fundamental problem is that the mind's a nerve-based learning system, which is insightful. It has to operate from a basis of understanding. So when the mind emerged, it had to search for understanding. There were none available. But whenever it made a mistake, the instinctive self criticized it. And so it implied that we were bad to conduct these experiments in self-management, when we weren't. And we got angry with innocence for its unfair criticism of us. And we have had to live with this sense of guilt, this implication that we were bad, when we never were. The mind had to search for understanding. It had to make mistakes. The innocent self, we needed the guidance of our conscience to tell us when we were being divisive or integrative, but we didn't deserve its criticism. We weren't bad to carry out these experiments, and it implied that we were. And had it had its own way, we would never have been allowed to conduct these experiments in self-management. So the ignorance of our original instinctive self, or soul, tried to stop our search for understanding. We had to defy it. We had to combat the ignorance of innocence. And so we turned on innocence and attacked it. And paradoxically, we had to start evading integrative meaning, because all our upsets that emerged from this battle, we became angry with innocence for its unfair criticism of us. We became egocentric. Ego in the dictionary means conscious thinking self. Our ego became embattled, forever trying to prove that it wasn't bad, explain itself. It was a catch-22 situation. We needed the understandings we were setting out to find in order to defend ourselves. So and then we became angry and we became alienated. We started putting our fingers in their ear, if you like, to block out the unfair criticism. So the more we searched for understanding, the more angry, egocentric and alienated we became. In a word, upset, the more upset we became. And eventually we had to strike a balance. If we were too free from the imposition of these ideals, free to search for understanding, we would become too corrupt. On the other hand, if we were too obedient to these absolute truths of ideals, of integrativeness, of selflessness, we would never search for understanding. We would be too oppressed. So socialism stresses obedience to the absolute truths of being social, communal and selfless and integrative, whereas capitalism stresses the need to be free to search for understandings. And we, as a community, vote. We say, oh, we're now too corrupt, we'll vote in Labor for a while, and practice obedience to the absolutes for a while. And that becomes too oppressive, and the need to be free, and so then we switch to vote in Liberals. Now, so we become more angry and more upset as we search for understanding. So what happens in the end is that we become excessively embattled. In the end, we can't live with ourselves. If we've been experimenting, and our ancestors that produced us, been experimenting in self-management, we can become excessively angry. Now, what do we do at that point? We need to find our way back, scramble back to the ideal world as quick as we can, because that's the only true world there is. And our soul lived in a really beautiful place where everybody was loving and there was no anger, no ego, no alienation. And after a long search for the understanding, we're becoming just living in darkness and completely lost from the truth. We blocked it all out. At which time we have to try and scramble back. At that point, our unevasive thinkers become very precious. So historically, we've looked for our prophets. These were the odd person that occurred who'd been sheltered from exposure to the battles that humanity was waging, and who still had access to all these ideals that we had repressed long ago. And they could walk around and express truths that we'd long since lost access to. So we quickly wrote down what they said, and through them we could live again, because we could be reborn.
Who are you talking about here?
Well, I'm talking to the founders of the great religions,
yes,
such as Christ, Muhammad. They were exceptional innocents, exceptionally unevasive thinkers. And that's why we murdered Christ, because his innocence only reflected on our lack of innocence that we couldn't defend. So the great paradox is encapsulated in Christ. I mean, that's why we wear a cross and things like this, because you see, while we murdered him, he also... his innocence was the ideal that we had to repress. Humanity had to lose itself to find itself. We had to be prepared to go out and to win in the end. For the restoration of the old ideal world, we had to be prepared to carry out these experiments in self-management and cop the inevitable corruption of self that resulted. And so the presence of innocence, both was a symbol of the ideals, but it was also extreme criticism. And Christ is extremely hurtful to some people. And this whole battle. So people, once we become exhausted, we have to live off through our religion. We go and live through one of these people, and we can be an effective force again in spite of our exhaustions. And it was the most amazing thing when religion came to earth. Imagine being a Mongol whore and raping and pillaging and expressing your angers to the nth degree until the end you just cannot live with yourself anymore. I remember reading about Burt Reynolds and all these sexual conquests, and in the end saying, look, I got to hate myself so much. I was just desperate. And then suddenly there was these religions. I mean, very great prophets emerged who could really articulate the truth, had not lost access to that magic world and all the truths that reside there. And through them we could live again. And currently, in the old days, in our more naive times, we collected our prophets. But now their great innocence only reflects on our lack of innocence. And so we repress innocence. We repress our prophets. We're mechanistic, not holistic. In our desperation at present, we're trying to find our way back to a more holistic approach. But it's a very dangerous world, since it confronts us with our divisiveness that we're unable to defend. But now that we can defend ourselves, we can confront God. It's the end of adolescent man, of insecure man. We've found identity now. And all our upsets can subside now. And gradually, as our understanding of why it all was the way it was become clear to us, our mind will find peace. So this brings peace to earth, this understanding. This is what we've been in search of for 2 million years, the defense for ourselves. We can now go back to innocence and say, now listen, we weren't bad, and now we can explain why. I mean, religious assurances such as God loves us, while comforting, didn't allow us to understand ourselves. We still had to find that understanding. So while we were still finding the mechanisms that might make a full explanation possible, great prophets got in the way in a lot of ways, because they just reminded us of our lost world of paradise, and they reminded us of our corrupted state, which we were unable to defend.
So you're suggesting really that man's journey has been a most heroic one so far.
Fabulous. To take somebody now who's at the bottom, take a football, it's like being a football match, Now, Ray Price comes off the football field and covered in scars and embattled in his dislocated shoulder and everything. But he's completely happy. His cup's held high and he's smiling, and we're all in parramatters and tears of joy for his winning. We don't worry about his exhaustions because we know the game he's been involved in was worthwhile. But humans come off the battlefield exhausted. And because we've been able to know the merit of the battle that we've been in, we can't see ourselves as wonderful. We're just insecure about our exhaustions. We can love ourselves now. I can take an extreme, someone who's been I don't know, grown up with their parents have been, that are having been left in the cross or somewhere. These terrible things that are happening now outside this very building, and I can take that boy or girl and I can tell them now a story, a wonderful story that humanity's been through, an incredibly worthwhile journey, and they can then, for the first time, see themselves in that journey as being worthwhile in spite of their exhaustions. They can love themselves. And they can and they have so much courage. I mean, they paint their hair red and they try to have an identity for themselves in spite of this incredible oppression that they're a bad person when they're not. And now they can love themselves. They can understand themselves. Understanding is freedom, is compassion.
Jeremy Griffith is speaking, and he's the author of a book which contains his thinking for the last, 13 years?
13 years.
It's called Free, the End of the Human Condition. What difference do you feel this is going to make to the world if people truly understand it and take it on board? What change could we see?
It's not like a religion. Religion depended on abandoning our thinking self, this thing that got us into so much strife, and just living through these, hanging on to these ideals, which can become very important to us, because that's where you get sort of fundamentalist approach, because those religions are what's saving us, and any threat to those is challenged. But it's not like a religion. See, this is the understandings that our mind needs now. These are the tools to think with. In the past, we tried to understand that we could, but couldn't.
What difference do you think it will make, though, to our attitude and behaviour towards the environment, for example?
Well, as I say in my book, this is the end of a 2 million years lifestyle. We will now dismantle our cities because there's a book about an American now best-selling called Tom Wolfe's Bonfire of Vanities. He said New York is just a bonfire of vanity. Well, it is. And it's our egos now, our desire to try and establish our worth, that each one of us is committed to winning somehow, to winning a game of football, to win anywhere. We are punch drunk for relief from this incessant criticism we live with. That's ended now. I mean, all our competitiveness can subside now. And we will go on playing the game we've been playing for 2 million years. It'll take a while to dawn on us that it's all over, but it is all over.
But what will be the effects of that? How will we see difference?
Well, we won't be angry, we won't be alienated, we won't be egocentric. Our great difference in personalities that we see amongst humans are all our different encounters with this battle, with the human condition. So our personalities will become very similar. I mean, people who try to put down the future, when they have a flash look at it occasionally, say, oh, it'll be boring. But they don't understand that we've lived off the adventure and repressed the other great positives because we couldn't have those other positives. But now we can afford to look at those other positives. There's a world that we have denied and repressed of so much magic that all the things that we've collected to sustain us, lovely meals at night, sex, all these other distractions, rate absolutely nothing.
Would you see us taking more care of the world if we are truly
absolutely.
Illuminated by the idea that you outlined?
Absolutely.
Yes.
I mean, I say in my book that the green movement and this desire for a steady state ecology to try and save our environment is really only a stopgap measure. We have to stop the fundamental upset within us. We have to resolve the anger, the alienation, the superficiality of people, us, we have to, those things are now soluble. We can go back now and unlock all the doors that have been locked inside us. All our upsets can subside, and then we will become sensitive, incredibly aware. There's a world out there of so much beauty that we can now tap, that we've never been able to tap. And occasionally a great artist might just make some cut a little window into that magic world through which we could all get a little access to the paradise. But there's a world, 1 minute of our life, 1 minute of the future, the beauty encapsulated in that would be more than all the beauty we can accumulate in a whole lifetime. There is nothing that man has created remotely compare with the magic of our lost paradise.
So what is death then in the scheme of things that you're describing?
The answer, if we were ideal still and hadn't become embattled and upset, death wouldn't worry us at all, because we would be so selfless, so concerned for the larger whole, that our life is only worthwhile in terms of what it contributes to the whole, and that we have a limited life it's not a problem.
But is death in any sense returning to the whole?
Yes, we've departed on this grand journey. which has all been worthwhile. And so our life and everything about it carries on in the effort. Our effort's never lost. And that is really the true sense of our afterlife. All that we do is never lost. We say hello to someone in the morning and be kind. That goodness flows on. And everything about our life carries on. So it is true. But we don't come back as a cow, as Shirley MacLaine would superstitiously but like us to believe. But we do have an afterlife. Our spirit, the determination of humanity to champion this wonderful device, the mind, carries on in the work of everybody. Mm-hmm. And death, we in our insecurity, we become very afraid of death. And it can consume us. But it's just an expression of our lost access to the truth.
And what is art?
Art is people who cultivate some access back to paradise. So they, as I said earlier, try to cut a window back to paradise so we can live through it. And they do it at great pain to themselves. Once again, if you confront beauty, it only accentuates our sense of guilt. It confronts you with our lack of beauty. So artists can, like Van Gogh, they struggle so hard to grab this rose, and all they feel is the prickles. It just accentuates the question, are we a bad species? I mean, the rest of us can just go on denying and blocking it out and not even worry about that fundamental question. But if you grapple with beauty, you're grappling with God, you're grappling with the question of our goodness. And the more you discover beauty and find access to it, the more you make your life difficult and confront yourself with our inconsistency with it. So the artists give us all a respite, a place to go. We can go and touch beauty again through them and their work.
Through music, through painting.
Absolutely.
In all those ways. What about your own art, your own craft, the making of beautiful and ingenious furniture? How does that fit into your thinking? How is that satisfying to you? How is it congruent with your philosophy?
I grew up in the bush, and I've always been good with my hands, and because I have a lot of imagination, and so working with wood's incredibly rewarding. It's a wonderful material. It's been with mankind all time, so we have an affinity for it. It's warm and giving, and someone said that wood has as much give and take as the human body, so it's a fair fight. It brings the best out in both contestants. So working with wood's incredibly therapeutic. See, creating things with your hands, or with anything we create, we take it for granted, the magic of creativity. But it's the mind's ability to manage events that allows us to manipulate a world so effectively. So creativity is the most reinforcing of things we can do. If we make something, the reinforcement, the marvel of that creation, it's just stunning. We take it for granted. As I said, we've been living with it so long, but really it's incredibly reinforcing. The magic of creation, of our ability to manipulate our world to our own desires, is an astounding talent. And so I think children television is numb. It doesn't give them the reinforcement. They should make things and be reinforced through that. The power of the ability to manipulate, to use their mind. And that should then raise the questions of the meaning of all this beauty and creativity. So making furniture for me was a stage in my development towards these more serious questions.
Jeremy, what do you most hope for now?
Well, I most hope that all the suffering on the world will stop and the devastation of the earth will stop. And my effort is towards that, to try to bring peace to earth at the most critical point. And I just kept focusing my life closer and closer to the real problem, and then tried to unscramble the real problem. And that led to these explanations, which bring peace to our mind.
So will you keep moving around, speaking, as you're being increasingly invited to speak, meeting people?
I will talk to anybody. I will do anything to help explain these ideas and to bring peace to people's minds, to take the pain out of our brain, to champion humans, to give us the understandings that liberate us from our upset.
And to bring us a better world by the sound of things.
Absolutely.
Jeremy Griffith. His book is called Free, The End of the Human Condition. You can order it by addressing an envelope to Jeremy Griffith, care of Caroline Jones, ABC Radio, GPO Box 9994, Sydney 2001. And as usual with all our guests, I'll be quite happy to forward your letter on. The cost of that book, by the way, postage paid, is $12. I do hope you'll join me tomorrow morning to hear Ita Buttrose.